It's the 10th of June, 1857. We're in Peshawar. Today it's a city in Pakistan, but back then it was a strategic foothold in the northwestern corner of British India, under the administration of the Bengali presidency. What should be just another balmy summer's day on this sleepy fringe of the empire is unfortunately starting to look rather menacing. Imperial soldiers from all corners of Her Majesty's realm are running back and forth in their military uniforms, carrying gunpowder, shouting marching orders, and stuffing grape-shot ammo into cannons crested on the horizon. It all looks like the prelude to some great clash of powers. But this is no battle. In fact, this is an execution. Today, these great lumbering beasts of smoke and fire and steel won't be used to smash down fortresses or carve holes through ranks of cavalry. Instead, they'll be used to quite literally tear the condemned limb from limb, one at a time. 40 men, to be exact, each guilty of rebelling against the British rule in India. All will soon be subjected to a punishment so excessive it borders on theatrical, an almost comical level of ballistic overkill. These condemned men are sepoys, soldiers native to India that had been employed by the British to maintain order and security in the region. They had since, however, been found guilty of rebelling against the empire. The British would ensure that this disobedience would be paid for in blood, and that they go out with a hell of a bang, so that everyone else got the message. As these broken, failed rebels were marched out towards their site of execution, their composure began to break. Most would have expected to be hanged or shot by firing squad. No one would have imagined being torn apart at point-blank range by cannon. It would have been difficult to surprise these wretches by this point too, having endured days of torture since being captured. One particularly humiliating punishment was forcing them to clean a chamber where executions had recently taken place. Since the sepoys were said to have been the ones guilty of spilling blood in the first place, they were given neither mops nor rags to clean the clotting sanguine off of the floor, but told instead to get on their knees and use their tongues. To add to the torment, chili powder was applied to pried open eyes, and intimate areas were branded with red-hot pincers. You might think that, in the light of all this suffering, such a swift and sudden end would be a relief to the sepoys. But this method of execution was particularly terrifying to them, since they believed that in order to have peace in the afterlife, they would need to be buried whole, and the cannons would make sure there was nothing but scraps to bury. Since there were more prisoners than there were guns, most would have to sit and watch the ordeal before it was their turn, adding to the horror. Once the guns were loaded and primed to fire, the men were taken one by one and strapped to the business end of the cannon, so that the point of the gun rested in the small of the victim's back, and their arms laid outstretched, fastened to the wheel on each side of the gun. With that, the fuse was unceremoniously lit. The sound of cannon blast ripped through the air. Dust was kicked up into the faces of spectators, and the man strapped to the mouth of the cannon simply ceased to exist, denied his right to live on either in this life or the next. An English soldier named George Arthur Stent witnessed the event and described the process in painful detail. When the gun is fired, his head is seen to go straight up into the air at some 40 or 50 feet. The arms fly off right and left, high up in the air, and fall all at perhaps 100 yards distance. The legs drop to the ground beneath the muzzle of the gun, and the body is literally blown away altogether, not a vestige being seen. Death would have been instant, of course, but those who were forced to go next onto the cannon would have had to march through the strewn entrails of their atomized comrades and had the hot steel of the gun pressed into their naked back, knowing that within mere moments they would be turned inside out with a thunderous shot as their body is consumed in the violent smoke. All that was left then would be to join their comrades in an afterlife of torment and shame. To quote an excerpt from an 1867 edition of The Times, the rebels were punished in a manner they understood. The body was destroyed, the soul was denied. But all of this begs the question, what had the sepoys done to deserve this eccentric death sentence, and why was the British Empire using a military tool for such a theatric and brutally extreme form of capital punishment? This is the story of execution by cannon. By the mid-18th century, the British East India Company had transformed from a trading enterprise into a powerful military and political force, steadily expanding its control over the vast and diverse Indian subcontinent. But Britain was not the first to wield the power of gunpowder in India, nor was she the first to wrestle this grand territory into submission. The Mughal Empire, which had ruled large parts of India since the early 16th century, was among the first South Asian powers to master firearms, employing cannons and matchlock guns to conquer and consolidate territories. It was under the Mughal Empire that the first execution by cannons was seen in India. Although stubborn in her own way, Britain was keen to pick up a new trick when convenient, and the legacy of tearing renegades and rebels apart at the muzzle of a gun was then passed from the Mughals to the British, who continued using it as a tool to terrorise disobedient locals. In 1760, it became a regular feature of imperial law and order in China, but it wasn't just locals in the firing line. In 1798, mutiny broke out amongst the British soldiers in the 1st Battalion of the Madras Foot Artillery. One British soldier was condemned to be blown from a gun. Others would write home of their experiences on watching an execution with the cannon. One such account reads as follows. After the explosion, the grouping of the men's remains was very frightful. One man's head was perched upon his back, staring around as if looking for his arms and legs. A cloud like a dust storm composed of burning muscle, fat, shreds of clothing, lumps of coagulated blood, a stomach or a liver came falling down in a stinking shower. To add to the humiliation and disgrace, birds of prey and stray dogs would often circle the execution grounds, waiting patiently for a chance to swoop in on an easy meal. Some birds were reported to be brave enough to get so close to the cannon that they could catch goblets of half-cooked flesh as it was blown through the air. But while Britain was game to learn a few nasty tricks from India and the Mughals, she also had plans to reshape the continent in her own image, sparking a centuries-long debate around the ethics of empire. With the building of a modern infrastructure and the building of a European-style army also came moral reforms, much of which rubbed locals the wrong way. By 1829, the practice of sati was banned in India. Sati, if you didn't know, was an ancient custom in which a husband's widow is burned alive on his funeral pyre. Its banning was seen as a fantastic moral triumph for Britain, who was not just throwing her weight around in the colonies, but could now comfortably play the argument that she was a civilizing force. Over the following decades, educational reforms saw English replace Persian as the administrative language, and missionary-run schools started to promote Western values and Christian ethics, often dismissing native faiths such as Hinduism and Islam in the process. The most outrageous changes, however, occurred in the military. Britain established Indian regiments of soldiers called sepoys, modelled in the European style. Some of these sepoy regiments completely abolished and forbade the acknowledgement or practice of the Indian caste system in favour of a more meritocratic and pragmatic method of organising ranks in the military. Instead of being born with a social rank that translated to your military position, soldiers now had to start on the same playing field and earn promotions either through outstanding service or through time spent in the regiment. In theory, it was a fair way to distinguish soldiers from one another and have an army run by the best soldiers in the regiment. In reality, it was unbelievably offensive. The caste system had been around in India for nearly 3,000 years, and now members of the low and high classes were sharing the same sleeping quarters or enjoying a meal at the same table. It was, to them, outrageous. But so far, Britain had been able to keep these simmering tensions under wraps, and through a calculated mix of diplomacy and force, she was able to quell minor uprisings and calm local fears that Britain was trying to Christianize India. All was well in the jewel of the crown, and there was no need for any mass displays of blowing people apart with cannons. That was until a minor argument outside the munitions factory spilled into a full-blown scandal. As I mentioned earlier, the caste system in India was no joke. It governed everything from birth to burial. So when a low-caste munitions worker tried to sit alongside a sepoy from a higher caste, he was quickly rebuffed and told to remember his place in the pecking order. But the worker wasn't pleased. Furious, he shot back that the sepoy had no right to claim high caste status. Why? Because, he claimed, the very rifle the sepoy carried, the new British-made Enfield, had made him ritually impure. To the sepoy's horror, the worker explained that the rifle's cartridges were greased with a mixture of cow tallow and pig lard, and since loading the weapon required biting the cartridge open with the teeth, the sepoy, without even knowing, had just violated both Hindu and Muslim dietary laws, the cow being sacred to Hindus and pork being forbidden to Muslims. So, with every shot fired, the sepoy was swallowing sin, and now the low-caste worker said smugly that since every word the sepoy said was for a mouthful of cow fat, they were technically equals. This petty quarrel between a soldier and a factory worker lit the fuse on what would become a continent-wide explosion, a rebellion that would shake the British Empire to its core and eventually lead us to the cannons. It didn't actually matter whether this rumour was true, though it probably was. The East India Company scrambled to contain the fallout, insisting the cartridges weren't greased at all, or issuing new ones that could be torn open by hand. But to many, these were just panicked half-measures, and all the more proof that Britain had, in fact, been caught trying to destroy local religions and replace them with Christianity. In Meerut, the pot boiled over. When 85 sepoys refused to bite the cartridge, they were shackled and jailed in front of their comrades. That night, the barracks erupted in violence. Prisoners were freed, officers were shot, civilians were butchered, and the rebellion had begun. They then marched to Delhi, raised the old Mughal standard, and declared Bahadur Shah II the Emperor of Hindustan, a ghost of an empire called back from the grave. For a moment, it looked like history might be rewritten. This started more or less a civil war, and it was absolutely savage for both sides. One witness, a British woman named Julia Inglis, wrote, "The air was thick with smoke. The houses were burning on every side. There were dreadful sights, bodies horribly mutilated, women and children lying in pools of blood. It was as if hell had come to earth." The harder the sepoys and the rebels hit, the more brutal Britain was in return. To quote Reverend Gopal Chandra, the white men killed everything. Men, women, even children. Anyone brown was a rebel to them. The blood ran down the streets like water. By June, Britain had managed to capture some of the sepoys in British India's northwest. The pocket of resistance there had been temporarily stabilised, and now it was time to punish, publicly, to drive the message home. Blasting from a cannon seemed like a fitting punishment, and many of the British soldiers felt personal animosity towards the rebel sepoys. No one was in the mood for mercy. And so we find ourselves back on the field outside Peshawar with 40 men being lined up to be blown to pieces by fire and gunpowder. It's interesting to note that it was Britain's insensitivity towards local religious customs that had kicked this whole thing off. But now that it was time to punish, all of a sudden they were able to pick the exact method of execution that was most religiously consequential. And so the sepoys' story ended with the cannons. But the bloodshed in India would continue, claiming somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million lives by 1859. It was also not the last time that the cannon would be used as a tool of execution and power. But despite its fame and theatric quality, blasting someone from a cannon is a wildly impractical affair, bound to go wrong at some point and utterly reckless even when done properly. Although typically the cannon would not be loaded with an actual round, sometimes mistakes were made. In one case, a cannon was loaded with grape shot, which can be thought of as a kind of shotgun effect, except on steroids. And as the grape shot burst through the condemned man's stomach and shredded him to pieces, the projectiles themselves continued flying, eventually striking members of the crowd. Things got so bad in one case that members of the audience were requiring amputation after being struck with the shot. And even if the cannon is not loaded, as is usually the case, and it's merely the force of the explosion that tears the condemned to pieces, soldiers and spectators could often be peppered with chunks of flesh and slivers of bone, blasted into the air at such high speed that they embed themselves into anyone nearby. This is sometimes called wet shrapnel. And even when everything does go to plan, one must always account for chance and botched attempts. One eyewitness account recalls such an event. One wretched fellow slipped from the rope just before the explosion. His arm nearly ignited. Hanging in agony under the gun, a sergeant tried 3 times to shoot him, but the pistol misfired. Finally, a rifle was fired into the back of his head, and blood poured from his nose and mouth like water from a briskly handled pump. This was the most horrible sight of all. I've seen death in all of its forms, but never anything to equal this man's end. Horror stories like this would eventually begin to change opinion on the use of the cannon. If Britain was going to claim that she was a civilizing force, then she'd need to do a lot better than these performative displays of brutal justice. By 1861, it would be outlawed, and no one would ever again have to be blown apart by a cannon. The world finally moved on from this terrible practice. Until 10 years ago, when in 2015, reports started coming out of North Korea that political dissidents were being executed by being blasted at point-blank range with anti-aircraft guns. Although it must be said that these reports haven't been confirmed. Perhaps all of this is less to do with theories of justice and the ethics of empire, and instead Mao Zedong had hit the nail on the head with his famous quote that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Maybe it's as simple as that.